So welcome to our 12th session of Identity Access Management. Right now we have scheduled session 13 and session 14 for the next couple of weeks. And all of these recordings are available on the YouTube channel. I also post the slides that we're going to look at together. And at the end, we're going to do a quiz together. And once the session is over, I make it self-paced, so you can do it on your own anytime you want. And it's a great way to study and do your knowledge check. So you'll be able to get all three of these things. As we're going through this, I just want to do a friendly reminder. I have been studying along with everybody, and so I'm really sharing what I've learned. I'm not a pro at this. I have passed my certification, and I have used some of these, but I definitely want to let you know that I may make mistakes. So if you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, feel free to stop me, interrupt, and add any of the knowledge or examples that you have, because that way we can learn from each other. So today we're going to cover a couple of OAuth flows we haven't talked about yet. I think this is our 4th session on OAuth flows because it's a pretty broad topic. And I can tell you for certain it is very important for your certification to know these OAuth flows very well to make sure that you pass. So today we're going to look at Headless, Forgot Password flow, the refresh token flow, looking at OpenID Connect dynamic client registration, the initial access token, OpenID Connect token introspection, and then we're also going to do a summary on all of the flows. And as time allows, we'll do some of the quiz questions. For the past few sessions, we've kept the slide consistent. And so if you have not had a chance to watch the sessions, you can go to session 10 and 11, and these are the respective pages for those flows that we covered in the last couple of weeks. And today we're covering the 3rd section on the last column. All right, so Headless Forgot Password flow. This one's interesting to me. It's definitely used for if you have an experienced site and you're managing access through that, but your application is external to Salesforce. It's not on experienced site. You have a custom application, maybe it's a mobile app, maybe it's a website, and you're just using Salesforce for authentication. So you're using your customer identity with Salesforce. And the way this one works is your application or your client needs to be authenticated and authorized to Salesforce before you can use this flow. And once that has happened, then you can help your customers and partners reset their passwords. It does require an experience.url. It's not just my domain name. And when you set this up for your user, you need to make sure that you get the OAuth token for that integration user that you authenticated in step 1. And the scope that is required is forgot password. If you don't do forgot password, this will not work. And so this is something to keep in mind. There are a few other headless flows that we use for experience site, and this is the last one that we'll cover today. And the way this works is once the client is authenticated, if you look at the documentation on Salesforce, it walks you through the steps that the user is going to walk through. But at this point, you've already authenticated your application, and the client is just kind of bouncing back and forth. A couple of things to keep in mind here is for your user, they're staying on your application, and it's just your application that's communicating with Salesforce. They never go to Salesforce to authenticate or authorize resources. It's all in your system. So the user forgot their password, so they're going to request it from your, we'll just call it a website. And from your website, you're going to display the forgot password page. The user is going to enter their username. This is very similar to how you're used to doing it in Salesforce. At that point, your application is going to call the forgot password API. And again, it's already authenticated, so there's no nothing to do here other than call your APIs. Salesforce will receive the request. If they find the correct person, they send a success message, and they're going to say, basically, we're going to send them a one-time password that they can use via email. So the client is getting this information on the back end. You are going to display that page to collect the one-time password on your application. When the user receives it via email, they're going to enter it, and they're going to submit it. At this point, this flow is showing the happy path where they're going to submit their one-time password and a new password. If everything is configured correctly, then the Salesforce will verify the one-time password and sets the new password. But in these two boxes, you can actually bounce a few times because these password policies are based on what you've set up in Salesforce on that profile for those users on Experience site. So on the Experience site, you said, here's my authenticated user, and they're required to use a different password from last time. It has to have a certain number of characters, numbers, special characters, and so on. If your user fails to put in a password that meets the policies 5 times, you have to start all over again. And so again, this diagram here is a happy path. Once you failed 5 times, the application has to re-request a new one-time passcode. It gets emailed to the actual user, and then they get to go through one more time again. So you want to make sure that if you're using this, you give your user really clear messages about how to give us your give the new password to make sure that they don't end up looping through this. As you can imagine, people will not want to do that multiple times. So, but once it's been reset successfully, Salesforce sends a successful message. Your client understands that the user has a new password that is valid, and now the user can log in. And so again, the user and the client can have up to 5 times per each one-time password. And after that, you need to get a new verification code. So any questions on that? From my personal experience on my certification, I did not have any questions around headless flows for experience sites. As you know, that does not mean anything because there's always a question bank that can vary. And so when you're looking at the experience site headless flows, I would understand that they're available and I would understand what each one does. But I wouldn't worry too much about the detail of how they bounce back and forth, the number of times. They're not going to ask you that level of detail question, I don't think. It's all going to be, if you want to manage users' passwords on your application, how can you do it? And you'd be given a choice of potential options, and you'd want to select the headless forgot password flow. All right, let's go to the next slide. So the next one is the refresh token flow. And the thing about the refresh token flow is it's not really an independent flow. It's a subflow to some OAuth flows. And I think for both of you guys, this is your first session, but one of the things I want to highlight is general OAuth supports refresh tokens for any flow. Salesforce specifically is the one that limits which Salesforce OAuth flows will support a refresh token. And so this can only be done for web server flow, user agent, and JWT bearer flow. These will provide a refresh token. Nothing else will. Even if you add it into the scope, it doesn't matter. It's going to ignore it. It is not going to send a refresh token for some of the other flows like client credentials, user password, SAML bearer token, or SAML assertion. None of those are going to give you a refresh token. And once you have the refresh token, you can use it to either generate a new access token when one expires, or just to have multiple concurrent access token to be used by a client as needed. It's used in the authorization server because this is for the refresh token, and it does require the scope for refresh token and offline access for these 3 flows. So when we look at it and what that looks like, this is really a small part of the flow. And so when you're looking at refresh token, really the token expired. And so your client knows it's going to try to access resources with the current access token it gets. The token is going to come back as your token is expired. So it's actually going to get an error. At that point, the client says, okay, give me the new access token with my refresh token. And it's going to send the refresh token and more information depending on the flow that you're using. If you're using the JWT token flow, you include that. Otherwise, it just varies on the other flows that you use. Then you get reauthorized and you get a new access token that goes back to the client, and then the client can get the APIs. But the one thing that's not shown here is when your access token expires, you get an error first, and then you have to reauthorize against the authorization server. These flows are from Cloud Sundial. They're extremely useful. And so you want to be comfortable with these, knowing what's bouncing back and forth, especially the different actors that are in your flows, because these are critical to understand. Go to the next slide. So the next one is OpenID Connect Dynamic Client Registration for External API Gateways. And that's a pretty long one. And so basically what's happening here is there's an external API gateway like Amazon API Gateway, or in the past I've used Majory. Well, there's a whole bunch of there out there that basically your APIs are being managed by another system. And you end up saying, I'm going to use Salesforce to register who can use these APIs. And what that does is it lets the external API gateway create a connected app for each one of your consumers of your APIs. And it provides the client secret, consumer secret, and the secret key. The client secret and the consumer key to those consumers to access the APIs. So basically, this is really using Salesforce to authorize multiple consumers of your APIs, and your APIs might not even be in Salesforce. There's just an external gateway that's doing that. So when you look at it from a diagram standpoint, the client is going to request a resource. The first time that happens, the external API gateway, if it's the very first time, and I realize I don't have that here now, I'll update this diagram. The first time it will register the application, but after it's registered, it will authenticate the user against Salesforce and create the access token. And so this external API gateway sits in the middle, and the client is really communicating to something like the Amazon API exchange gateway, not directly to Salesforce. But Amazon is going straight to Salesforce to get that authentication. And again, each one of these clients, and this repeats with however many clients you have or consumers, will get their own connected app. And the other thing to consider as well is your external API gateway also determines what permissions each one of those apps get. So depending on the APIs that you're using, you might say for this API, it's going to get the API scope, but for this one, it's going to get a different scope. Maybe it's only looking at the user ID information for that scope. So it can do that. When it registers it, it will do the information for the client, the scopes, and get back the consumer ID and the client secret. Questions on this one? Because this is this is not a common way to use Salesforce, but it is possible to use it this way. This is another one where I would say, I know for my company, when we're using AWS API gateway, we're using AWS for the authorization as well. We don't have any reason to use Salesforce in this scenario. It's just something that Salesforce supports. Go to the next slide. The next slide is about generating the initial access token, and this works in conjunction with the dynamic registration. So you register this, and the very first time you do that, you can generate an initial access token. This token gets registered on your external API gateway, and this is how you're going to be able to connect in the future with it. And so again, it's used for OpenID Connect to dynamically register clients. It does generate that connected app I was talking about before, and you can create this initial access token via the UI. This token is usually pretty short-lived. It's going to be from minutes to hours, depending on the settings that you configure on your connected app. Once you have set up your connected app, depending on the OAuth flow that was set up for that connected app, you may need to follow a little bit different steps for it. So if you decided to use a digital certificate to do that, you would have to generate it with the proper key to be able to get your initial access token. After you do generate the initial access token, you do need to register with your external API gateway. So those two work together. I don't think I have a diagram for that one. The next one is OpenID Connect token introspection. So this is one where Salesforce allows you to say, I have an access token. I want more information about it. I want to know if it's valid. And so what this does is it lets your resource server check what is this access token about and what can I do with it. So it's going to go get the metadata about that access token, and it's going to come back with the user ID. Who does it belong to? Is there a session ID tied to it? Has that session ID expired? And it gives you the client ID. It also lets you know what scopes are registered for that access token with that connected app. And so you can say, well, this access token, again, gives me access to APIs, but this one doesn't. And then it's going to be using the standard OpenID Connect to be able to communicate that information back and forth. So for this one, I do have a diagram. And so the very first part is the standard flow that you have with OAuth. And this is just an authorization request. Authorization server is going to provide the request and give the token, the authorization code. Then there's going to be an exchange for the token here. And once they have that, it generates a token. It goes back to the client, right? Now the client sends that to the resource server. At this point, this is where this token introspection starts. The token comes into the resource server. The resource server is going to go say, what is this access token about? Comes back to Salesforce. There's some communication back and forth here to get the token information, retrieve the metadata, and this is when you get the scope of this particular access token. That goes back to the resource server, and now the resource server says, yes, you have access to that resource. I can give it to you. And that resource might be an API, or it might be data that is being managed by the resource server. Oftentimes, this resource server is also Salesforce, but it can be something else altogether. It does not have to be Salesforce. So questions on introspecting those tokens? And for this one, just keep in mind, this is of course only available to introspect access tokens. You cannot do this with authorization codes or any other kind of tokens like device tokens, asset tokens. This is purely for an access token, not asset token when you're using this. But it's a great way to check the security of that access token. Maybe it's been hijacked and you're trying to confirm the information on it, and you want to make sure that nobody can use your resources that should not be using them. So these slides are going to be a little bit content heavy. I want to warn you because this is our 4th session on OAuth. And so I ended up dividing this into 2 slides. And I wanted to do a way to look at all the different flows and compare them to one another. I would tell you that if you're planning to pass your certification soon, you need to understand everything on this slide and the next slide. This is really core to understanding when you get a scenario from the certification questions about when you would use one flow over the other. And so that's the way that I built the slide. I will probably end up dividing this a little bit more once I have a little more time to make it a little more digestible, but I like to be able to compare the information very quickly. One of the other things I'll share with you is I was looking at some of the videos that are online, and Ladies Be Architects has really great OAuth videos. The only thing is at the very end of the second video, they do a chart that's similar to this, and it has some information that's not quite correct. So I just wanted to highlight that if you're looking at that, I want you to understand that I changed it because when I looked at it, for instance, the JWT bearer token was across all the flows, and that's not correct. So just keep that in mind. Make sure that you're looking at the latest information because those videos are 5 years old, and this is based on the current information that we have on our developer docs. So let's look at each one at a time. So the one that we're going to start with that you need to know completely inside and out for your certification is the authorization code. And this one, it is highly recommended that you include the PXE as part of this flow. And we covered this one a couple sessions ago. And basically, the PXE is a way to validate that the client that requested the authorization code is the same client that is exchanging it for the access token. PXE is not required. I didn't have any questions about PXE in my certification, but I expected that was just a random thing because it is heavily encouraged not to add to this flow. It is used to obtain permission from a specific user, the data that they're using, and it's often used with web server applications, mobile, and desktops. This one is pretty high security, and it's the most recommended flow for user authentication for OAuth. So that's why you really need to understand it because it's very commonly used, and it's got pretty high security on it. You want to add that PXE, and it's PKC, pronounced PXE, to reduce the risk of anybody hijacking authorization codes and trying to take over it. This flow, because it does support the refresh token, it can be long-lived. So once you have the refresh token, you don't have to keep getting authorization from a user. You can just continue to get a new access token from that refresh token. The drawbacks are that the client, your application, is required to maintain the consumer key and the client secret. So you want to make sure that you're doing this in a secure environment, that it's not a public application, because otherwise they'll be able to access it as well. And so if you don't store this properly in a secure server, it does pose an issue for security. So again, this one you need to know inside and out, and it does use the authorization code grant type, because it's requesting the authorization code. When it gets the authorization code, it will exchange it for an access token. And I see a chat. Thank you, Barbara. Sorry. So the next one we're going to talk about is the JWT bearer token. This one, it's using the JSON web token as part of the flow, and the grant type is JWT bearer, and you are exchanging your JWT bearer for an access token directly. The reason you're doing that is because it has a very high level of security. This one supports a digital certificate, and because of the digital certificate is what lets you create an encrypted JWT bearer token. That's why you can exchange it directly for the access token, because the Salesforce, the connected app, you've uploaded your digital certificate, which is the public key. Your client has the private key. You're creating that token with the private key, and then it's being decrypted by Salesforce with the public key. The client application is usually a service or an API that needs access to Salesforce resources. So this is really server-to-server integration. And again, it uses a digital certificate. So if your security team comes to you and says, I'm requiring you to use a digital certificate to improve our security, one of your options is the JWT bearer token flow. It does, like I said, give you a high level of security, and it reduces the risk of the token being tampered with. If somebody happens to get a hold of your private key, that's a different story, but then you have different issues there. You do want to make sure that, like I said, the client has access to the private key, and you want to store it properly so it does not get misused. The next one, and I have them very close to each other, is because it's very similar. The next one is called the SAML bearer assertion flow. Your grant type for this one is SAML2 bearer. And again, you're going to be exchanging your SAML bearer for an access token. This is when you're going to be authenticating with Salesforce using SAML assertions instead of a client secret. This also uses a digital certificate so that you know how to create that SAML assertion. And so these two flows are the only ones that support digital certificates. Once you have the certificate on the client app and the connected app, you can create your SAML bearer assertion and get that exchange for the access token. This one, in addition to that, it's higher security because it's using the tokens instead of SAML cookies. And SAML cookies have become less secure recently, because then somebody can hijack the cookies that you have in your browser and then take advantage of that across your application. So it's something to keep in mind. This is also higher security because it does not expose the SAML assertion to the end user. It's all done on the back end. The creation of the SAML assertion, decryption, and converting to access token is all done very securely. The drawbacks are that, again, you need to have the client be able to generate a valid SAML assertion, and you're working with SAML. So you need an IDP, you need to understand XML versus JSON code. SAML assertion is a little bit different. SAML assertion flow, this flow is the only one that does not use a connected app. And this one is going to be using the grant type of assertion. And the assertion that you're providing is going to be exchanged directly for an access token. And usually this is when you're using authentication outside of Salesforce. So let's say you have maybe Azure AD, or maybe you have Okta or Ping Federate, and that's how you're using your authentication. Oftentimes these are larger companies that have implemented single sign-on. That way, the user only has to log in one time and they can use those credentials across multiple applications. When you're doing that, it makes sense to use that SAML assertion to grant access to the resources. And again, it's very useful if you're already using SAML because it does make it very straightforward. It simplifies the process. And like I said earlier, there's no connected app. You're not storing client consumer keys, client secrets, or anything else along those lines. This also does not use the digital certificate, so it's pretty light. But again, it's going to require user intervention because they might need to sign on if they have if their SSO session has expired. It does require the client to be able to generate a valid. I am going to take this out. This should be just a SAML assertion. So I'll fix this on the presentation before I post it. It's just a regular SAML assertion. It's not a bearer assertion. And it does require the use of a third-party IDP. Like I mentioned, it can be Okta, Ping Federate, or Azure AD. The fifth one on this page is client credentials. So client credentials is the grant type will be client-credentials. That's pretty straightforward. You're once again exchanging that for an access token directly. And this is when the client is acting in its own behalf. So this is going to be a server-to-server integration. It's not relying in any user context. Nobody needs to authorize and authenticate and authorize in part of the flow. It's just getting the resources directly with what it has. The benefits are that the user is not required. So if you have a server-to-server interaction, you can just go with that directly. It's pretty simple to implement. And it provides high level of security as long as you're keeping that information secure on your server. And the drawback is really that you cannot use it with individual users, but most of the time client credentials is just a very easy server-server integration that can be done. So that's the first 5. We have 4 more to go to. Any questions on these 4 or how they relate to each other? All right, let's keep going. Oh, there's 3 more. Sorry, I said, well, it's really 4, but 3 columns. So the next one is a username and password. And so your grant type is password, and you're exchanging the password directly for an access token. This one is one of the least desirable ones to use because it needs to be a really highly trusted client that you're using. Either you created the mobile app or the desktop application, and you need to make sure that the credentials can be stored securely on the client side. It can be used for legacy systems that don't support other OAuth flows, but the problem with this is you're really requiring the user to enter the credentials before they can be using the system. A good example that I had a couple weeks ago was I was staying at a hotel and I can log into my Pandora account, but I had to put in my username and my password directly into the TV, and I did not want to do that. I was in a hotel. I did not want to enter my credentials. It was also kind of a pain to type out my whole username and my whole password instead of having the ability to use a code and use a mobile app to just go do that kind of authentication, which is much easier. But this one poses a lot of risk because you're exposing passwords that are being entered and they're being passed through the request. The next one is user agent. The grant type is implicit and you're getting an access token directly. There's nothing else in the middle to exchange for. This is often used in public applications that cannot securely store a client secret. And the client secret is going to be your consumer key and your client secret from your connected app. And it's going to be using the resources of the user that's being logged in. And so this way you're not able to cross data from other users, and you know that you're just using that particular user's access instead of anybody else's. The benefits are that it does not require you to store a client secret, but also that, of course, also comes with a little bit less security. And it provides a better user experience than entering somebody's username and password. And for instance, like I said, for my Pandora account, I did not want to enter my username and password. If I had had a QR code that I can scan and then just log in through a mobile app, that would have been using the implicit flow instead, and I would have been far more comfortable doing it. The drawback in of itself is that it does not store the client secret. It can be more vulnerable to attacks, and it is a little bit less secure. These 2 in particular it's preferred to use the other flows from the other page that I showed you versus these. The last column that we have, it's really 2. And so we have the device flow, which the device flow is exactly what I was describing with Pandora. I instead of typing in the username in my TV like I had there, I could go to a mobile app. And I know Amazon lets me do this. Amazon doesn't even let me type in my password. I have to scan the QR code. It opens up my Prime app. I say yes. I put in a code that's shown on the TV, and that lets Amazon know that it is really me trying to log into that device, and it lets me connect to it. That device tends to be something simple that does not have an interface. TVs are a little much smarter now than they used to be, but maybe you have a smartwatch that you're wearing, not an Apple Watch, but maybe a Fitbit that doesn't have an interface that you can type into the phone. I'm sorry, into the device. So you need a phone to be able to do it. I combine this with the asset flow because the asset flow is something that Salesforce lets you do when you want to register a device as an asset in Salesforce. Once you've done that, you are able to tie it to the customer record, like the contact and the account. And if something goes wrong with that device, maybe it's a sensor out in the field, and you can check that there's something wrong with that particular device, you can open up a case on behalf of the customer and you can route it to somebody to go either do field service on site if something needs to be fixed on the actual device, or maybe you need to push software and fix it that way. But the device flow is the basis for the asset flow. The asset flow cannot be used independently. It has to be used together. And I put them together because they're very related to each other. I will tell you that I did have questions about both of these flows in my certification, and you want to understand when you use one over the other. And like I said, the asset flow is the only one that's going to let you create cases on that device, because then that device is registered to a specific either individual or company. Drawbacks are that it does require some other either mobile application or browser to complete the process. Because the device is so simple and does not allow input, it does not let you do a whole lot with it. So any questions? So those are all the slides that I have for us today. I do have a quiz if you want to participate in that. And so if you haven't joined yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'll keep posting these videos and adding them to our playlist. And if you want to join the Orlando Architect Group, we almost always have hybrid sessions. The next session is coming up on May 11th, and that will be our 14th Identity Access Management session, where we're going to do a big overview and then tips and tricks for passing your certification. And please link on LinkedIn, connect with me or follow me. I love to share knowledge with other Salesforce folks, and that way I can ask you questions in the future as well. So that's that presentation. And so we're going to do the quiz now, and the quiz has a few questions. So let me go to the quiz.
Thank you, Marlene. That was really good.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, I'm going to take the last two slides with the summaries and make them a little bit easier to digest, because those two slides are critical for the certification.
Awesome. Thank you.
Welcome. And so if you've done these before, and if you want to go to the quiz page, you can join us here. Most of these, we have a few questions. We probably have enough time to go through about half of them. And I'm going to join on my phone along with you guys. And don't worry, I don't cheat because I take it with you. Oh. Yes, I will share the link. And the way that these questions work, if you've taken them before, is we'll show the question. Whenever I can, I have a link to the supporting documentation in case you need it later for validation, or maybe I made a mistake with the question. And so we'll go through them. And so if you want to register, we will. Hi, Ola. Hi, Daisy. Hi, TDA. All right, we're going to start the quiz because I think there's 3 of us today. Looks like I have 16 questions. What types of apps can use the user agent flow? Select 3 answers. And so the 3 that are supported are going to be your desktop apps. It's going to be apps running on a browser using JavaScript and your mobile apps. The other 3 are a bit of a cheat because they're all devices. So your Internet of Things devices and devices are kind of the same thing. And your secured assets are also going to be devices. And so devices do not use the user agent flow. They use the device flow and the asset flow instead. Next question. Question 2. Match the OAuth flows to the drawbacks. So these are the drawbacks, and they all have an answer. Ten seconds. And so these came from the last 2 slides. And so for your authorization code, you are required to maintain the consumer key and client secret. The JWT bearer token, the J stands for JSON, web token. And so this requires the client to have knowledge of the private key or the digital certificate that you uploaded to the connected app. And you're going to generate the JSON token. The SAML bearer assertion requires you to be able to generate a valid SAML assertion. And a SAML assertion, this was tricky, right? It requires the use of a third-party IDP. So we'll go to the next question. Again, these drawbacks are good to know because the way that they do it on the certification, they'll ask you, your security team does not want you to rely on SAML assertions. What else can you do, right? And when they ask you that, but they're using single sign-on, you would go with SAML assertion flow. So the drawbacks are important. Question 3. Match the OAuth flow to the feature. So these are features, and they all have answers. Fifteen seconds. And so the authorization code, it's recommended that you add Pixie, but it's not required. The JWT token is, JWT bearer token is going to have use the certificate that you upload to create the JSON token. And it does that with the digital signature. And SAML bearer assertion is more secure than SAML assertion because instead of using the SAML cookies, it's using the SAML bearer token instead. Next question. Question 4. Match the OAuth flow to the features. There's 3 of these. Ten seconds. And so for this one, the user agent is going to be the individual user authorizes and doesn't use user credentials, right? So you're not entering password and username. That's the one that you oftentimes see, do you authorize this data to be transferred on your behalf? The device flow is going to be simple devices without interfaces. And the asset flow is when you're registering devices to provide case management. And again, I want to underline the case management part for asset flow. You'll get questions on that in certification. So make sure you're very familiar with that. Next question. Question 5. What is required to use the headless forgot password flow for consumers and partners? Select 4 answers. The right answers are experience.url, OAuth access token for integration user, forgot password scope, and integration user to manage external user permission. Connected app is also right. So I have a feeling I need to update this question. Because when it was 4, I'm like, wait, connected app is required. So I'll update the question because all flows require connected app except for SAML assertion. All of the other ones require it. And let me go to, I'll check the documentation just to see why I excluded connected app. And I'll verify that it's how I initiated this question. All right, next question. Question 6. What is the flow for headless forgot password flow for customers and partners? Probably did not give us enough time for this one, but we'll try. This one was hard. And so the flow is the user will request their forgot password feature. The client is going to collect their user identifier, whether that's a phone number, an email address, and request the one-time password from Salesforce. Salesforce sends that one-time password to the user. The user will enter that information on the client app along with the new password. The client will submit the one-time password and the new password to Salesforce, and then Salesforce will verify the one-time password and sets the new password if it meets the password policies. Once all that's done successfully, the client will inform the user of success. This is a good example of this flow. I wouldn't worry too much about the sequence. I would definitely know the sequence for the authorization code flow and the refresh token flow. You want to make sure you understand those really well, because I know one of our other study buddies shared that she had seen one of those questions about flows, the sequence of the steps and the certification. So you want to know those well. But for these little ones for Experience Cloud, I don't think I would worry about it. Hopefully you don't get questions on it. Question 7. What is true about user agent flow for desktop and mobile apps? Select 4 answers. So this is a great example of I didn't really remember all the answers, but I knew which ones were wrong. And so it does not support the client secret for the user agent flow. And so that's definitely not there. And it does not support the PXE. PXE is only supported for the authorization code flows. And this one uses the implicit grant type. So you would not be able to use the PXE code. And the implicit grant type, it's not able to store the client secret. And for the certification, I had a lot of those questions. Like, I know these 2 are wrong. Question 8. Which flow is recommended over user agent flow for external apps? One answer. And so in this one, I struggled between the 2 that are selected here. I couldn't remember which one it was for sure. What I focused on was the PXE portion of it. So the user agent flow does not have any kind of validation against it. But when you add the web server flow with the PXE, it's more secure. The authorization code with credential flows would also be possible to use, but it's not necessary. You could just add the authorization code with PXE. Keep bouncing back and forth between those 2. Next question. Question 9. Match the OAuth flows to the feature. Select 3 answers. And so in this one, the SAML assertion is the only one that does not use the connected app. From OAuth flows, the client credentials, it's going to be acting on its own behalf in its server-to-server integration. And the username and password, it's really the least desirable one, and it's used for legacy systems if they don't support any other options. And this is where you're entering the username and the password directly. Question 10. What is true about refresh tokens? Select 3 answers. And so it can be provided along with the access token. It can be used to generate new access tokens, and it's used on the authorization server. A refresh token does not generate other refresh tokens. It will only generate access tokens. Next question. Let's see how we're doing. Results. Daisy, you're catching up. Question 11. With the headless forgot password flow for customers and partners, what happens if the user enters the new password that does not meet password policies? Select 3 answers. So the client can make up to 5 attempts per one-time password correct. Salesforce will respond with a policy check failure if there's a problem with it. And after the max attempts, they can request a new one-time password. Nice job. Next question. Question 12. Mobile app is implementing headless forgot password flow for customers and partners. What are important considerations? Select 3 answers. We did not cover a lot of this today. And so the correct answers are the mobile app is a public client. You must implement an API gateway because otherwise you cannot maintain the information secret. And you must implement the integration user. It does not require the ID scope because the ID scope is for user information, not for usernames and passwords. And Salesforce never generates the new password, right? It's going to let the user go through and enter it once they've been validated. Question 13. What scope is required to return a refresh token on a connected app? Select one answer. The correct answer is refresh token offline access. If you were to select full, it does not give the refresh token. It has to actually explicitly call for refresh token. The API does not give you a refresh token because it only gives you back like the RESTful APIs from Salesforce or the data. We're going to finish up the questions so that we have them on the recording. Next question, question 14. What is true about refresh token flow? Select 5 answers. This one I couldn't remember, but I went by what I thought wasn't right. And so it does not support Pixie, that's correct, because refresh token is not using the access token. And it is not supported by the asset token. The asset token does not give you back refresh tokens, and all of the other ones are correct. It is supported by the web server flow. It is supported by user agent flow. The other one that's supported by is a JTW token flow, which is not on this list. The client can use it to generate a new access token when the current one expires. The client app can use it to get concurrent tokens to use them at the same time. Does not have to wait for one to expire to get a new one. And it supports either the client secret or the client assertion. Next question. Oh. Question 15. Match the OAuth flows to the drawbacks. So these are problems with the flow. And so the correct answers are the client credentials cannot be used for scenarios where you need a user authorization since it acts on its own behalf. The user and password requires a user to provide the credentials. The user agent cannot store the client's secret securely. And the device flow requires a user to use a mobile or browser to complete the process. And our last question for today, question 16, is why would you use OpenID Connect token introspection feature? Select 3 answers. So the answer is you can validate the token. That's the access token that you're getting. You can validate the token metadata, the user, the date, the session information, and you can verify if the client has access to the resources because you'll get back the scopes associated to the access token. You cannot use the introspection feature to expire token or to expire refresh tokens. And it also will not validate the client secret. Only the connected app will do that when you're doing the initial OAuth flows. And that's our last question for today. Thank you so much for joining. And I hope you had fun. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to stop recording.